So the rest of the talk will focus on the following subtopics. I'll talk about global trade and the savings glut. Where did the savings go? The U.S. household behavior, I'll argue that it's pretty rational. The savings glut, or whether it's a glut in labor supply or both, and how financial engineering helped create a housing bubble, and what makes the housing bubble different, and the way forward, and some final thoughts. So the focus here is the global trade in goods and capital flows. And if you look at the number of players, the center is the U.S. household. And of course, then you have foreign countries, I'll typically call it China. Then you have the U.S. government, the financial sector, and U.S. corporations. So U.S. households, they export goods and services to abroad and import goods and services. And then any deficit has to be met through capital flows, and those capital flow into the U.S. government, securities, and also to U.S. corporations. And then you have Wall Street, which come up with innovative ways of creating new securities to channel all these flows from one place to another to another. I'm going to talk about some of these issues that we face because of all these flows. Without doubt, I don't want to be mistaken to say that I am in favor of globalization. Globalization has given us enormous benefits. It has increased the developing world's standard of living in a reasonably short period of time. Cheaper goods and services in the Western world, in fact, very little inflation in the Western world, and everybody has benefited. If you look at 1982 to 2008, emerging economies in Asia grew at an astonishing rate of 7% per year, year after year, on average. But then came 1997 financial crisis in Asia, and the Brazil, India, China, the BRIC countries, and the newly industrialized Asian countries, which is these four countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Korea, and of course the Middle Eastern countries, they all noticed that capital mobility can create a lot of problems. And therefore they focused on creating sufficiently large reserves for safety. And dollar being the reserve currency, they wanted to create a huge amount of dollar holdings. It became almost an obsession. And of course, you do that by current account surplus. If you look at the global trade and how the current account balance looks like, in fact, in 1996, the BRIC, NIAC, and ME current account balance was a positive $4 billion. In 2007, it's about $800 billion. And if you look at US current account deficit in 2007, essentially roughly equal to the current account surplus of all these countries put together. So what would you think? Standard economic theory will say that if everything is, handling the right way, the US dollar should have depreciated. But that didn't happen. If you look at the Chinese yuan, in fact, China was the major creditor of the US. 1995 to now, it's just flat. There's no change. I will argue that they had some other national objectives that motivated them to do this. So there's a huge amount of capital inflow into the US in the 21st century, and to balance the huge current account deficit, especially from China. The Chinese holding of US assets. The initial holdings was about $72 billion in treasuries and $20 billion in agency securities in 1994. As you can see, almost all the holdings was in treasuries. But subsequent flow, because of course it lowered the interest rate, so it made other investments more attractive. Roughly 50-50 was in treasuries and agencies. So you could see that a lot of flow was going into other than treasury securities. And if you look at how important it is, it's really big numbers. It's about a quarter of GDP of China was the holding of assets in the US of China. And it's become bigger since then, if you look at today. If you look at, for example, the pattern of which assets changed, so this gives you how much each class of assets increased or decreased. You can see that the treasuries started playing a less important role over time. So the increase is in basically other assets. To accommodate this huge money inflow, investment banks set up their own pools of private label non-conforming mortgages, providing investors with the desired high yields, with of course hidden, very ill-understood risk. U.S. policy to promote increased, home ownership also played a major role in this. That funneled the money flow into the U.S., into the housing market. Home mortgages indebtedness went up as current account deficit actually became larger and larger. So this picture gives you, on the left axis, this is deficit. So the minus means if the current account balance is negative, which is deficit. And on the other axis, you give the indebtedness of the American household. These are all per household numbers, okay, per U.S. household numbers. And you can see that in 2006, for example, the mortgage loan went up. It increased. The increase in that 1 year was about $8,000. And you can also see that about $7,000 was the increase in, that is the deficit in that particular year. So essentially most of the deficit went into increasing the outstanding loans of the households in the mortgages. So why did U.S. households consume more, leading to huge increases in the current account deficit? Why did they increase the borrowings by so much? I'm going to argue that the U.S. households in fact behaved maybe rationally given their beliefs. Okay, you may argue that the beliefs were not reasonable, but hindsight is 20/20. Let's look at household consumption and wages. Private consumption to GDP ratio in 2000 was 68.7% in the U.S. 2007 it was 70.3%, so it went up. Those are big numbers. It's a fairly sizable increase. 2000 to 2007, wages, salaries, benefits, social security, and proprietors' income to GDP was 66.3%. It came down to actually 64.2%. So why did consumption increase even though wages, etc., remain flat or came down a little bit? It's because U.S. households felt very wealthy. Why did they feel wealthy? If you look at the stock market, 2000 to 2007, it was flat. In fact, in between it went down and then came back up again, but it's essentially flat. But housing prices increased by about 86%. The S&P Case-Shiller index went up from 100 to 186. That's where most of the gain was. This is how the S&P 500 index looked. So it's flat from point to point, but there's a big dip in between. If anything, they should have felt a little worse off. And you can see that most of the increase, home prices increased very steadily. In fact, there was no drop at all over the 20 years. And then the increase was much sharper during 2000 to 2007. And then, of course, it started coming down again now a little bit. Okay. Home equity per household. If you look at from 1980 to 2000, went up by 72 or 73,000. 2000 to 2007 went up by about 63,000, 64,000. And 80 to 2000, the household home equity went up by, well, the first one was household real estate value, and the home equity went up by 52% of that during 80 to 2000. And 2000 to 2007, it went up only by less than 30% of the increase in home values. That means they were taking out the money more.